In fact, even though my libido was kicking up, I knew it had to be a reason. Like this, it was like flipping on machinery that's in my body that had been dormant for a while, that all of a sudden, well, there must be a reason for this.
There's a switch. There's a switch.
Yeah.
You flip it, and it instead of flowing out, it flows in and upward along the spine into the brain. And after a while, when you actually awaken Kundalini, it needs that energy, that vital energy.
Hello, everybody. This is Venice McNeil with another Magical Egypt Live. And I am very excited to introduce you guys to a book and some people that are working around this book. And it is called The Secret of the Golden Flower. And the reason that we are talking about The Secret of the Golden Flower is that in the new Magical Egypt series, it is something that we dive into quite deeply. Now, this Secret of the Golden Flower is a book that was written in China about 1200 years ago. And it is fundamentally a book that talks about Neidan, or inner alchemy. And that is something that we covered in season 2 of Magical Egypt, but we're going even deeper into it in season 3. But it was written in Chinese and it was translated. But the thing is that the guys that translated that particular text never had actual experience with activating their Kundalini. And so along comes J.J. Semple, who has one of the most amazing Kundalini activation stories. And he actually takes those texts and works through them and kind of is like a man in the field guiding you through this entire process. So I'm very, very delighted to introduce you to J.J. Semple. J.J., hello.
Hello, Venice.
Hello, my love.
How do I pronounce your name, by the way? Your first name?
Yes, it is Venice. Venice.
Venice, okay.
Venice, yes. My dad couldn't decide between Vanessa and Denise, so I got Venice in the middle. Now, the reason that we came across JJ in the first place is because a gentleman by the name of John Saraki, who is, among other things, a Magical Egypt fan, has been invaluable to us in our journey along the way of understanding these very, very complicated concepts. And John, in fact, introduced us and told us about JJ. So welcome, John Saraki.
Hey, Venice.
Hello, darling. Okay. All right. So John is interesting because John also has been working with the concepts in the Golden Flower, and we basically worked through JJ's book, if I'm understanding correctly.
Correct. Matter of fact, the first book I read on it was the Cleary version of the Golden Flower. After that, then I did read Wilhelm's version, and also JJ's books as well, in Deciphering the Golden Flower, One Secret at a Time, and The Secret of the Golden Flower. I've also read some of his other ones, The Biology of Consciousness, the case studies in Kundalini, and also the Semen Retention book. And it was really nice to see someone who had actually gone through the process and what they thought was important. And JJ does break it down as far as the steps of what you need to pay attention to while performing the Golden Flower meditation. And I practice it as, again, a subset of a greater magical practice, raising Kundalini as far as, from my perspective, as an important step in everything, including, theurgic practices, and just general concentration. Anytime you're working ritual magic, concentration is most certainly an important step. But in reading it, I was pretty amazed at the difference between the different translations. And I was pretty happy to find that JJ favored the Wilhelm version, which is the one he used. Just because you could tell there was a definite difference in between Cleary and Wilhelm and how they viewed the work. And I would have to say that Wilhelm took a phenomenological approach to it. He was sympathetic to the material and to the practices. Some of the comments I saw in Cleary was that, at one point he had said that the Buddhists at one point were addicted to altered states of consciousness. It just seemed a strange comment, that this is what we're relegating it to, as an altered state of conscious,
Well, I think it's interesting because you say phenomenological, because JJ, you liked it because it was more poetic. Is that correct?
Well, when I started to read it, it was given to me and I put it aside for a year because I was in a fun, loving mood living in Paris. And finally, one day I just picked it up and I was kind of captivated by the poetic expression and took it out as a challenge. And once I realized that it was a method of meditation, for some reason, it just kind of hooked in with the yoga practices that I had started up. I was in my early 30s. I'd started the yoga when I was like about 27. And little bit by bit, I kept finding these terms like the backward flowing method, or action through non-action, or non-action through action, and puzzled like exactly what that meant. And finally, I realized that these were physiological, were representations of physiological events or sensations, and that to the everyday person, coming across a term like action through non-action, what the hell does that mean? It just has no meaning. But when you're meditating and you realize and you learn to breathe with your diaphragm, and it's beginning to be made clear that when you sit in a quiet room and you breathe and your breath becomes inaudible, the more you just deeper you breathe, that it actually starts to kick off a process of sensations, energy detection in your lower belly, or I don't know exactly where I characterize it as the lower belly. And that's you realize that these are living terms. They actually have meaning. The same thing with the backward flowing method.
So, John, you're in the process of doing these practices as well, right? And so when JJ says these things are discernible, you've also got to the point where you are aware of these processes, correct?
Yes, absolutely. There's a couple of interesting differences too between JJ and I. He was in his early 30s when he was performing this, correct?
Yeah, when I started, I started the yoga, and it just naturally fed into the meditation, all largely because of breathing exercises that I noticed when I just kind of made up my own breathing exercises while I was doing yoga by walking a lot, just walking and breathing through the nose and counting over and over, 1, 2, 3, 4, inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, hold, 1, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, start over. And I started to feel things. I started to have these sensations. And yeah, so you're going to tell me that you were a little bit older or something? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
As far as hatha yoga practice, I'd been doing that since my 30s and into my 40s heavily at one point. But when it comes to the golden flower and actually attempting to raise Kundalini, I didn't start that until my early 50s. Because I'm 53 right now, and I started around 51. I started actually with AA practices, Master Crowley. There are two main books called Liber E and Liber O, which are basic practices, and one of them is a pranayama practice of Nadi Shodhanam. It's essentially alternate nostril breathing. And this is the first thing I started out with, and I performed it for about 18 months. Starting out, of course, slower. You can't sit for an hour right off the bat. It took me probably a good 4 to 5 months before I could sit for a full hour. At that point, the pattern I was using was a 1-to-2 ratio. So I was doing inhale of 10 and exhale of 20. So a full round that's basically inhaling to 10, blocking nostril, exhale 20, inhale 10, exhale 20. So a single round is a full count a minute. It's 60 seconds. And I would keep track to kind of focus my mind of my breath count and also the round count I was on. So once I'd gone through 60, I knew I was approximately around an hour. And I was a little slower than the clock. So it would take me about an hour and 5 minutes, hour, 10 minutes. And I would practice that daily. At the time, though, when I was going through that, it wasn't absolutely every day. Once in a while, I would take a day off. I went through that practice. But once I had gotten to the point where I was doing it for a full hour, a few months after that, my ajna, chakra, in other words, like my sensation right here just became permanent. It felt like someone had a thumb against my forehead the whole time. And around that time, a little bit after that, also I had, and again, this is the difference you may not have seen being in your early 30s compared to being in your early 50s. As I went through my 40s, even though I stayed in good shape and everything, I exercise and eat right, but your libido does drop. Testosterone drops after a time. So all of a sudden what happened is I got a big increase in libido, which makes a certain amount of sense. Focusing here, brings a lot of blood to the center of the brain. And I think human growth hormone kicks in. So I started noticing a lot of changes just from that alone during that time period. And knowing
that really shows a lot of discipline, John. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people who've read my books and said they were practicing the method, but no one that is able to talk about and describe your practice in such detail. That's really commendable. I'm sure you're going to get there, or you've already gotten there because of it. It's most people don't last that long. They're very superficial about their practice. They like reading about it, but they don't like doing.
Right. And I very much so follow, I think there's a reason why Crowley wrote his book, Magic and Theory and Practice. The practice definitely illuminates the theory. So at that point, yes, you're right. I'm now on day 402 of solid meditation and golden flower meditation. And during this time, I've noticed a constant progression, of different sensations. Not only does the ajna become permanent, but at a certain point, the Muladhara did as well. It seemed to be a pinging between these two centers.
Do you feel any weakness if you ejaculate, after ejaculation?
I've cut back on that quite a bit. In fact, even though my libido was kicking up, I knew it had to be a reason. Like this, it was like flipping on machinery that's in my body that had been dormant for a while, that all of a sudden, well, there must be a reason for this.
There's a switch. There's a switch.
Yeah.
You flip it, and it instead of flowing out, it flows in and upward along the spine into the brain. And after a while, when you actually awaken Kundalini, it needs that energy, that vital energy. And to ejaculate, you feel an immediate sense of weakness. Did you read Gopi Krishna's book? I mean, he talks about that. It devotes a whole little episode to that, how he first had sexual relations with his wife and immediately felt weak. And that's how you can pretty much tell that you've taken that step, and you've got to cut down, or you've got to learn seminal retention.
Right. I absolutely agree. Although I wouldn't, I've noticed that the sensations are not as strong if I do ejaculate. So it's been one of those things where when we talk about like backward flowing method, you're right. There's a poetic nature to this, in the fact that what are we talking when we talk about backward flowing? Not only like the flowing of energy in the body, but also just the backward flowing in our habits. Stopping what we would naturally do. You're right. Our normal impulse is procreation. So to me, the whole thing was reversing that. And it's not something after 50 years of a certain habit, to stop and slow down and reverse my even thinking on it. The way I view sexuality and everything has had to reverse. So I've kind of taken it that way. And yeah, I do practice seminal retention. In fact, I've gotten better, longer and longer periods without ejaculation. And I think it is critical to it, because the sensations are more certainly stronger. As I've continued on within this past over a year now, Golden Flower, not only are those two centers active. But I've also started noticing that it broadens up to my entire forehead. This area where normally in Buddhism they consider the Satguru area or associated with it, and the sensations continue to go where I started having itching up the middle of my scalp, like a itching, tingling, heading towards the crown, and it became more and more prevalent. It would stop for a while, then it would come back, and now that section is also the crown. The Sahasrara has become permanent. So this entire complex between the crown of my head, and the ajna, that is always on. Entirely what it means is hard to say. I started to wonder, because I know at a certain point you said that you could feel then the energy flowing up, like a little cracking, like a small egg in the perineum, and then you would get that energy flowing up until it reached the brain.
Yeah, obviously it's not semen itself or
right.
liquid. It's a distillation of those energies. That's the only way that it could possibly be drawn up the back into the brain. And that's another key issue, is not forcing it or thinking it up the spine, but letting the practice draw the energy up the spine.
Right.
You see, that was a very big thing for me, Darlin, because as a yoga teacher myself, I asked JJ this specifically because in my yoga teacher training and in the work that I've done with pranayama and, for example, breathing up your sacrum, the sacrum doesn't have a nose, right? So I had to obviously utilize a degree of imagination to bring that breath up through my sacrum and up my spine. And so I asked that of JJ, and JJ made the very clear distinction that this is not an act of imagination.
No. Yeah, no, the golden flower itself is not it's not a visualization. Other things I've read into in practices, kind of in my period between Nadi Shodhana pranayama and golden flower, I did have a period of time where I was doing some Kriya practices, and those are definitely visualizations, of bringing energy up the spine, whereas the golden flower is not. It's attention to breath. It's hitting that spot, right here, and just kind of like you say, dropping your attention kind of into your lower stomach and just breathing and paying attention to the breath, the rhythmic 4-4-4-4 breath, and trying to clear the mind as much as possible. So really it's the hardest thing to do is to do nothing aside from breathing, holding your posture. And I don't know how important it was to you, and I don't know if you'd covered that much in the books, but clearing of the mind where you're not thinking. And I know that in the golden flower it's saying that it's not that important that you're absolutely thoughtless, but that you try to, when you do have thoughts, that you try to look for their origin or where they came from. And I've noticed, like, in doing that, it does tend to quiet thoughts.
Well, I found that the counting displaces the thoughts. So if you just count, you crowd out the thoughts and they disappear of their own accord after a while.
Mine slowed down, but even when I was doing Nadi Shodhana, I was counting two things. I was keeping track of my round count and the breath count. And it's amazing how automated
that's an awful lot.
Yeah, but it's like eventually the mind starts doing it, and then it starts branching off. That my problem is that once I get used to it, then my mind can still wander. I've had to be creative in the way I dealt with trying to just quiet any thoughts when they start arising or start noticing something creeping up. If I go back to its origin, I can stop it. And you're right, just concentrating or redoubling concentration on breath does help. It's almost a mantra in itself, in counting.
Yeah, that's it. You can shift from the counting into just observing the breath. And what you were talking about before, I think that mindfulness it's a kind of modernization of Gurdjieff's notion of self observation. That you do need that. I mean, people think that if they awaken Kundalini, somehow by magic, all the problems and all the challenges they face in life will somehow evaporate. But I've found that you do need a conscious mindfulness or a practice that to go along with it, to be able to jerk yourself back from emotional situations when you might tend to get too involved.
It is a conscious process, isn't it? I mean, it's the yamas and niyamas of yoga, where you need to be conscious. I found that I guess when I hear people say that meditation is makes you more peaceful, I didn't necessarily find that to be true. You have to actively work on it, and how I respond to stimulus every day, difficult situations or people. It's something that had to be very actively worked on.
What's really interesting is I've been talking to Brad Clausen a fair bit about this as well, in regards to his focus on season 2 on the 7 deadly sins. And he made a very, very interesting point that what might be considered amoral or immoral or moral for a particular culture could be considered completely normal. And so it's not necessarily the yama or the niyama in and of itself. It is the action of not getting yourself entangled in trouble. Right. So
Well,
you kind of
yeah.
possibly just want to get, just be able to maintain a state of mind that allows you to be receptive to the process.
Crowley was practical about that, and he thought that anything that you get involved with that upsets you during the day, you may well take into meditation with you later on. Depending, my meditation practice, by the way, has always been evening. It's been most convenient for me, and it's been a good time, for me to do it. But I've already had a full day's worth of work in by that time. So if I have bad interactions with people, and my job for many years has been customer service, so I would take that with me. So that all of a sudden amplifies as soon as I sit and try not to think of anything and focus on my breath. Those aggravations can come in, so that starts to dominate. So I think it's a practical, how can I say, practical aspect of this practice is to not engage during the day, to try to be as equal as you can, but it's something you most certainly work on. And yeah, it's not necessarily a religious, ethical.
Well, it's almost a physical thing. When you're at the bank and the line's taking too long, you suddenly find yourself at the, or a representation or an avatar of yourself right up at the head of the line, trying to speed things up, trying to do the person's job better than they do, because you're getting angry, you've been waiting too long. So you've got to pull back, and that's the mindfulness. As far as morality, you were talking, does the universe actually entertain the notion of morality? I mean, it seems to me that consciousness, and I'm no expert, I just, these are things that kind of corollaries that jump out after so many years of living with Kundalini, is that there is no morality, no arbiter in the sky that's going to, and we see this, I think, coming to a head. We're returning to a kind of dinosaur age of anger and raw physical confrontation, and nobody's going to step in and arbitrate. You're going to be, so why should you respect any kind of morality and our notions of morality? And I think that the one thing that kind of, the one guide, the one useful precept from religion, and they all pretty much share this, is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's all you need for religion. The rest is all just dogma and doctrine. And that's to in order to get along on earth together in an ever-increasing, facing ever-increasing populations. The golden rule is pretty much the only thing that you can count on, but it is man-made, not passed down from some kind of authority in the sky.
Right. And it's relative to culture. Yeah, absolutely. I always look at it that it's something you do for yourself. And again, if you're going to engage in a practice like this where you need to be kind of very focused, all that just simply becomes a distraction. So I take it as a very practical, practical aspect. Yeah.
Now, John has been doing this for 400. Is it actually 400 or 401? How many days?
400. Today would be 402.
Oh my gosh, what an anniversary. 402 days.
Yeah.
Now, JJ, just we had talked about this 100 days business in the actual Golden Flower text itself. It says, do the practice for 100 days. And so I don't think I've ever asked you, my love, how many days did you have to do this practice before your Kundalini activated?
You know, I check back on my books from time to time, or I come across something and I find that one place I said 100 days, another I said, you know, it just happened when it happens. But I do think that it took 100 days before that kind of detecting that cracking of the eggs and spilling out of its contents. That was a key landmark or benchmark where something actually happened. And I felt this, you know, if you feel a kind of a liquidy feeling in your coccyx, that's not normal. And I definitely did. And that from that point onward, it started to climb the spine, which took about a month or two to get to the brain and illuminate and start working and controlling it. You pass control to that part of the brain that you had never been used before.
And so, sweetie, you talk about these 3 stages: before, during, and after. So can you just elaborate that for the audience? Like, what is the before stage? Then I know that the middle stage is a quick stage, and then there's the after stage. And for you, the after stage has continued your entire life. Like, as far as I understand, you'll lay down at 5 o'clock and cycle Kundalini energy today, right? Once we finish this. So
well, it's always present. It's always present. It's always cycling. It's just that it's more acute when I do that. It's like a roar. You know, it's like high tide. Put it that way. It's low tide when I'm just about my business, and then it becomes a high tide experience every day and starts pulling and pushing in my actual inside my skull, and I can feel energy, like sensations all throughout the body that are governed by that Kundalini mechanism. It's not of my doing. So
what's the before stage? Like, what does the before stage look like?
I mean, if you had to find a typical person,
that's me. I'm typical.
Yeah.
Chance and I have a band, and we're called the Befores, because you know how the befores are always disheveled and the afters are always looking beautiful and good. So we're the Befores. So I am the classic before. Just for the audience, I haven't had a Kundalini event. I don't want a Kundalini event. I refuse Shaktipat and all this. So I'm like a really good before. So am I kind of the before, or is the before somebody more like John, who's been doing the practices of the Golden Flower? So like, what is the actual before period? What does that look like?
It looks like everybody is a before, but only certain people get to the next stage and then get to the after stage. But the before for me is those quirks of karma that allowed somebody like me, who was a East Coast kind of upper class person from private schools and boarding schools, with absolutely no tendencies towards spiritual self-investigation or self-realization, and just making all the wrong choices in my life, and somehow winding up with this meditation that quickly, in the scheme of things, brought on this tremendous rush of effects, and that others who've actually been trying to make these things, stir this whole thing up, never got it to work. And I mean, why me? I mean, that's, and then, like, you know, the next stage is, okay, you start, I can more or less identify when I started, And when the process started, I started it, but I can more or less identify that on a timeline, and I can identify when it actually ended, which is when the Kundalini took effect in one roaring night of its own. And then the after is that, you live with it and it starts ruling your life, and you can no longer do certain things, and you make certain choices that you never would have made before. And it's not wholly benign in the sense of everyday accomplishment process.
John, do you have anything to say about it's not wholly benign in your experience?
Yeah, well, in general, my experience is pretty different. Like I said, 400 days. I've never lost the desire to continue on because changes have continued to happen with me. There's one day I'm walking through the park, and like I said, I could feel waves of energy up my spine. Out the back of my head, I felt high while I was walking. It was almost an altered state of consciousness by itself. I haven't had the incredible cosmic experience that a lot of people associate with the full Kundalini awakening, but yet everything I've experienced, again, the awareness, the creeping up, all of a sudden everything, the sensations in my different chakras has been amazing, and it's wanted me to keep going. I don't know why. I'm assuming it's different for everybody. The Golden Flower, it says at least 100 days. And for some people that may well work. Like I say, why does it work? Why do some people get it quickly? It may take me longer. It may not happen at all. But what I have done is continues to astound me. Just to put that in there. And as far as the not always being benign, yeah, there's times where I've had emotional issues with it too. Where all of a sudden I have to really be careful of certain things. I can't get mad. If I get mad, I go down a rabbit hole where it will just continue to compound. I can find myself in a very dark place. So at that point I have to walk it back. Like I say, it does definitely change. Even at where I'm at, it changes my behaviors. And there's just things I have to take myself out of certain situations. Yeah.
Every Kundalini experience is different, really different. And I've talked with, I don't know how many, but very many people. Now, the closest person that I can identify with is Gopi Krishna. His experience and mine were very similar. And probably I can do that because he was such a good writer, and he documented it so clearly. So many people who have these experiences don't know how to explain it. And maybe that's a balance of my particular makeup, that I was able to kind of separate and observe myself at the same time it was happening to me. That I was like a curious explorer in a rocket ship that was documenting what was happening as it hurtled towards the earth or the moon or the sun or wherever it was headed. I'm still not sure exactly where it is. I guess when I die, I'll learn. But it's a practice. It's an exercise also in dying. That this notion of circulation of the light, I believe it stands for the same the light that comes or that's been documented or at least asserted that occurs after death in treatises like the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
That's a really interesting point. JJ, you mentioned that to me the other day as well. And a lot of this work in general, this esoteric occult work, is kind of learning to die before you die. In general, occult work is being described as that. So I think that at the very least is a very, very powerful contribution, right, to be able to do that work. But
so you won't be overwhelmed when it actually occurs. That's the thing, is to stay focused and to not get caught up in mourning. And anyway, that's another topic. But I think a lot of these books interact, if not wholly, partially, and it's just others. It's compilations. I mean, the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Secret of the Golden Flower. It's not like one person sat down and wrote the whole thing in one standing. These have been compiled over how many ages, I don't know, but probably around the 3rd century. They took form of paper form. That's why the ancients really kept this information secret, because each experience is different. And if I've met, for every person who's had a so-called positive experience, I've met another who hasn't had a positive experience, who's living in agony. And so I don't, I put a method on my websites and describe it in my books, but I'd never try to push somebody into it.
Mark Stavish in season 3 talks about that injuries can somehow be a progenitor for the awakening of Kundalini. And if I remember your story correctly, you did have a fairly significant injury that affected your brain and all kinds of things and your ability to do maths. Is that correct, when you were younger?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so basically what Mark Stavish explains is that somehow kind of, weakens the actual physical vessel to an extent that the normal locks and processes that are in place are kind of blown out of position. And so Chance, I would say, also is the beneficiary of having a Kundalini event, but his was also more, I would say, from a weakening of the physical vehicle. And while he was able to explode into that gnosis, John, that you're explaining, it was a very difficult undertaking for him, in the respect that he was incredibly emotional. And I think that what happens is that the work that you're doing, John, is, and that the Golden Flower actually does for you, is kind of clearing out the channels of these residual emotions and things that get activated when the energy starts rising up, right? And so if you haven't done that pre-work, that's when it can get pretty tricky and uncomfortable and can exacerbate imbalances that might exist in those chakras or energy vortexes that have not possibly been prepared if you force this process.
That's probably, I think I write about that. I don't know where, but I think I've certainly come across that, or it's just a lot. It flowed logically from the fact of this actual somatic and metabolic changes and physiological changes as a result of my accident as a child. That there's possibly a factor of strengthening this spiritual side, not under my control or under my will, as a result of my will, but just life force kind of compensate for that physical, logical changes by pointing me in the direction towards that I ultimately came to on this whole thing of hooking up with yoga and meditation. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, in fact, I've got Chance has given me a question here that I'm going to ask you. But before I ask you Chance's question, John, I know that you have some questions for JJ.
Oh, yeah. I guess one of the things I was thinking about was the Golden Flower itself doesn't end with the raising of Kundalini. I know the Taoists tend to look at this as a lesser and a greater circulation. The raising of it, to begin with, it would be the lesser. From there, they work on, and in general, they equate the lesser circulation with a fortification of the body, with cultivation of good health. And then from there, generally extension of life. And then they would work on the higher spiritual aspects of it. I'm just kind of curious, with 50 years of living with this force, how aware are you of, when it comes to spirituality, to the non-physical realms? Have you had any kind of experience with that, or have you like continued on with any other additional cultivation? Has it been a part of what you do at all?
Well, there's it, you do it, and that's in the beginning of the phase, during Kundalini, you're doing it, like in this case, the meditation. And when it finally happens, it starts doing you. So that takes care of itself, because it does me, and it has been doing me since 1972 or 3. I haven't been some kind of conduit for Shaktipat or something like that. I mean, am I the first person that put the golden flower, or the secret of the golden flower, use the term Kundalini to as part of something that actually as a process that the golden flower, the secret of the golden flower, was proposing? I mean, it never mentions once.
No, it doesn't use that the terminology. Yeah.
What do you think the term what is the term that they actually use to refer to Kundalini, or a placeholder? I mean, life force is, I think it's a perfectly acceptable term, but
well, it's very interesting, right? Because like you say, some people become conduits. Major religions, I mean, as far as Christ, Buddha, Muhammad, are all associated with this time period where there's a withdrawal from society, a deep searching, more than likely something of this nature, and a raising of Kundalini, whether it's through some practice, discipline, or if it spontaneously happened with them, and they come back and then lay out a religion that millions of people end up following. But we know there must be more than just the how you say, the progenitors of these religions. You know, there has to be more people who've actually accomplished this, who don't become conduits for anything, you know, or don't become gurus with followings. So I think it's just as likely that a person won't. It may be just simply self-realization. The golden flower, the Taoist texts never speak about Kundalini. It's not their vocabulary. It tends to be a lesser and greater circulation. And from there, you know, they don't use that same language. I've read some Taoists, like Stuart Ave Olson, who said that there seems to be a difference between Indian tantric practices and Kundalini practice and the Taoists, and the fact that the raising of Kundalini seems to be the end all in the Kundalini practices, whereas the Taoists see it as, again, one step, you know, in a greater process. That once they've raised this, then now they continue to go on and cultivate that energy. I guess you could say that this is not only seen in stuff like this type of practice. If we look at the use of entheogens, of hallucinogens, psychedelics, when you look at the ayahuasqueros in Peru, they use the drug to get them to a certain mental state, but then they use icaros songs to give it substance and shape. Maria Sabina did the same thing with her mushroom veladas that Gordon Wasson wrote about, where she would sing. She would get into the state and she would take mushrooms, oftentimes the person she was doing it for, whether they had a health issue or something of that sort, and they would go in and then she would sing throughout the night. And by the time she was done, she was brought to a place where she knew if it was an illness, she knew if this person could be cured and how. If not, if they were too far, she knew that. You know, so there always seems to be a raising, you know, or I should say, the being able to obtain or get into a state, and then from there use something to mold it. So that in itself, this force doesn't seem to have its own shape necessarily, other than causing great, like with you had a lot of correction going on in the body. I like the way you wrote about too, that you could even hear your skull cracking, you know, at one point, where it was kind of reshaping and remolding your body in certain places where it was deficient, as though there was an ultimate blueprint for who you are, and it corrected that. And it's oftentimes been described as an intelligent force or energy. From there, I think that it really just depends. I think that culture oftentimes and cultural practices can form the experience and maybe bring it into something else as well. I think that a lot of people who are walking around our society today, I've working in the public, the public libraries for years. I've often wondered, we have schizophrenic people who come in the library quite a bit. They're talking to people you can't see. They're having weird experiences. For all we know, they could have had a spontaneous Kundalini rising. And we live in a culture that unfortunately is completely insensitive to it. So this person walks around wondering why they're experiencing what they are. Is this a simple metabolic function of their mind, or is it something else going on? So I guess to wrap that all up, there are other things that can be done and other practices that could be engaged in. And that's where kind of my curiosity was to see, once you rose Kundalini, I'm not really sure if you continued on with meditation practice after that, or if you took it anywhere else, or the experience in itself was sufficient. I can't say because I haven't gotten there.
That's the way I see it, that it's a step, like you were talking about the Chinese versus the Indian. To me, it's a step. And like I say, it does me, and it's still working, and it's doing a lot of physiological work all the time. I think probably has to do with just the fact that I'm fairly coherent at a approaching elderly age, and I can sit down and write for hours, and it actually makes sense. And I'm my own best critic, and I throw out the bad stuff and or rewrite it. But I think that's my role, is to be is not to go out and start put on crazy robes and funny hats, and but to be a writer and to live it, and just to keep going. I just finished a 540-page novel. I call it a Kundalini novel that never once mentions the word Kundalini. But from the flow of action, you see the main character being funneled towards that end. So yes, it's a step. All of these, there's no final step, there's no final stage. It's just everyone is different. But me personally, I feel that that's my role, is much the same as Gopi Krishna was. I mean, he was a writer, and I mean, people don't realize, with the Googling number of pages on where, if you Google Kundalini, you get like umpteen pages. I mean, it's like there are thousands of website or other things about Kundalini, and still the greater public doesn't know very much about it, or never, Contrast that with my experience in 1972. There was one book, Kundalini, the Evolutionary Energy of Man. That was the book. And I happened to find it after my experience, so I was totally in the dark during this whole experience. I thought I was just meditating, and then things started to happen. And I said, well, I got to get away from people and go somewhere where I can do this alone, because I just can't do it and stay in the midst of an environment like Paris, with there's always some kind of something happening, fun, or just mystery, mysterious women, mysterious.
I was going to say beautiful Parisian women. Yeah,
it's interesting, right? Because I think I'm kind of I'm a bit of a stick in the mud when it comes to that. Like, I don't drink. I've never really been attracted to events, large crowds, things of that sort. I work, but most of the time, for the most part, I'm a homebody. I do a lot of reading. I guess I have a temperament that's suited to this. And like you said, I can sit down every day. I'm in here doing it. Even when in the past year, I did have COVID at one point. For about a day and a half, it bothered me, but I still made sure I was on the mat, and meditating. I didn't do a full hour, but I made sure I got a good solid half hour in, and even now if something happens, I still make sure. And I know that the golden flower itself doesn't assume perfect perfect days or perfect meditations, because I've had some days that were fantastic, where afterward I felt incredible and I'd really accomplished something. Then, but it was usually it would follow upon a day or two of just terrible things where I thought my concentration was terrible. Maybe I didn't feel the best. And then after that it would do it. I just know it's consistent. I'll make sure I do it every day. And I've gotten enough from it to the point where I'm intrigued and I want to keep on going. Whether
that's me pretty much now is that, but before, one of the things that just dropped away of its own accord after activation was this feeling, this nagging feeling that I always had, that I was missing something. Somewhere people were having more fun than I was having, and I was upset and blaming others, or blaming myself or pitying myself that I wasn't having enough fun. All that dropped away with Kundalini, and I found myself, washing the dishes was the same thing as going to a party. I didn't give a shit. It was just like a balance that just became apparent, like those things were figments, and I there was no point in pursuing them. What would happen would happen.
Chance doesn't have that, JJ. I
Doesn't
don't
have
think
what?
I've got him to the joy of washing dishes.
I didn't say it's joyful. I said it's not something forbidding. Like
no, it's just funny because I don't think I've got him to wash a dish in 20 years. But John brought up something a minute ago. John, do you have a middle name?
No, I don't.
Okay.
My parents didn't have much imagination. It was John Saraki. Yeah, not even Jonathan.
Okay, because we have JS and JJS. So I just thought, wouldn't it be interesting if you had another J in there? But you brought up this idea that Chance sent me a note about, that Kundalini is intelligent, and that there seems to be a blueprint, whether it is in our DNA or in our morphogenic field, however you say that, and that when Kundalini gets activated, it goes about restoring you to the perfect John, the perfect Venice, the perfect JJ, the perfect Chance. And you brought that up, John. And Chance just wanted to see if JJ had any comment.
Well, it's intelligent. It doesn't know how to balance a checkbook, or it doesn't know how to use multiplication tables, or it doesn't know how to write a 540-page book, but it knows DNA, and it knows the inner workings of anything that precedes or is superior to DNA. In other words, like practically for me, is I felt this kind of overlay, like this body that was overlaying my physical body, and it was different in different places. And I saw Kundalini trying to pull and push, and this other spirit body trying to use it as a template, and you can kind of stand over it, as I did, and look at it, and then have it fit over my physical body and start to do this work. And I mean, this is very hard to grasp, because science would be dead set against what I'm saying, at least right now. Maybe in 100 or 1,000 years, it'll have been absorbed by science. But for now, I mean, this is out there, and
it's like the science of the ancients that one of the things that Magical Egypt tries to do is redeem this knowledge that we had way, way back in the past, and we've seemed to have forgotten about it or had it stashed away, and now it's starting to come back to the fore. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is such interest in Kundalini again now, guys, because it is people are the information is filtering back into the consciousness, and it's just beginning. So I think you're right there, JJ. Maybe 100, maybe 1,000 years. We'll have to see, and see if your immortality practices keep you around for another 900 years, darling.
Well, one question I have for anybody is, why Kundalini and why now? And is it really a factor in evolution? I mean, we're going to evolve no matter what, but with all these people all over the world, without anything in common, with no common culture, no common language, no common geography, no common culture, are these individual Kundalini events, are they having any impact on evolution as a whole? I mean, have we jump-started evolution? Are we capable of actually interfering and moving it ahead quicker than it intended to be had we not started this? I mean, look around, read some of this stuff. It's very, very far out there, and things of blueprints and before, during, and after, and the backward flowing method, and action through non-action. I mean, all these concepts are, from all these different, I mean, John knows probably a lot more than I do about, because I pretty much, stuck with 2 books, with Gopi Krishna and The Secret of the Golden Flower. I've read a lot of other books too, but I'm not the scholar that he is. He really is very knowledgeable about that. But the things come to me, and I observe them, and I throw them out there as kind of test questions, like this whole thing of is Kundalini actually interfering in a good sense with evolution?
John, what do you reckon?
Yeah, that's why my practice of trying in attempt to raise Kundalini, at least raising prana in the body, and heightening those levels, is associated with other practices that I do. Now, one thing we haven't talked about so far, and this is what's interesting about Kundalini being intelligent, is the fact that if we start going into more of the occult realm, if I start going into this idea, we start getting to the idea of like the holy guardian angel. At least in Western magical tradition, it's been called. In Greece, it was the holy daemon, or the daemon, personal daemon. This is a concept that goes way back. Even I mentioned earlier, that whole concept of the kind of the top part of the forehead in Buddhism is associated with the Satguru, or the teacher within. Getting in contact with that. Within practices like the AA and even Golden Dawn, that their idea was to contact this being, and the being, now mind you, there's many different ways of doing this, and the aspect is there's most certainly a personal aspect of it. Crowley wrote about this as being the difference between the vision of the holy guardian angel and then the knowledge and conversation. One happens at an early point. In fact, there's a reason why in the grades of these orders, the probationer robe for someone going into this work is the same as the robe of the person as the Adeptus minor, which is a person, the difference is a person functioning somewhere on Yesod at the beginning, and someone, even Malkuth, and someone functioning in Tiferet, where the complete knowledge and conversation is actually done. And this relates to the fact that there's a microcosmic aspect to this being, or at least our connection to a universal intelligence, and there's a macrocosmic aspect to it, that there's one inside and one without. And in general, when we look at this Western tradition, we have 2 pretty popular concepts going there. We have the pentagram and we have the hexagram. The pentagram represents man, it's spirit over the 4 elements, fire, air, earth, and water. The hexagram represents divinity, or the macrocosm, the greater universe around us. The whole concept is to join the 2 and to raise consciousness from one level to another. There's an awful lot of argument back and forth about the nature of spirits and the Crowley got. I just want to take a segue here too and talk about science for a second. Gopi Krishna also did this in his book, where he really was science-minded. He wanted to explain that this is a definite force inside of people and that it's a potential that can happen. And he wanted to approach this in a scientific way and wrote extensively about it and did a lot of good. Same with JJ, where, you're definitely explaining this phenomena that happens and that we're absolutely capable of doing. Yet we tend to get into trouble. Crowley got into trouble when he tried to legitimize occult practices in his introduction to a translation of the Goetia, which is a Solomonic magic book that was translated by S.L. McGregor Mathers. Mathers wouldn't publish it. Crowley did, and he wrote a foreword to it. And in there, he tried to explain all these beings as being aspects of the psyche, that they're psychological aspects, And there's been a argument ever since. There are grimoire purists who believe that, no, these are objective realities that exist on their own. And there are people who follow a psychological model, say, just what Crowley did, that this is a part of you. Although Crowley never fully said that, in other words, he didn't stick to that. His idea is that these things are different. They can be outside of us, inside of us, and there's a strange relationship or entanglement. And later on, even Solomonic magicians, I've mentioned before, but John R. King talks extensively in his book, The Faculty of Abrac, where he starts looking at what these beings are, and what our relationship is to them. So it's complicated. It's not a black and white in either way. But this energy, just to go back to Kundalini itself, and the microcosmic aspect of this holy guardian angel experience, to me, is the beginning phase. It's when you first start to connect to your own personal sense of divinity. I am not entirely, in my own work and what I do, I am not worried about gaining acceptance from a scientific community. I believe it's a difference in materialism, and spiritualism. I don't think, and I should say, instead of just spiritual, to say subjective experience. There may be a science behind what we are, but the reality is that the experience in and of itself is not quantifiable. We really can't necessarily quantify all these things. So I personally am less interested in trying to gain that kind of acceptance. And I think every time we do, we get into a problem here, and sometimes people are just plain simply negative to religious terminologies and whatnot. So I don't think we can always reconcile those two different worlds, nor do I try.
So how they say the revolution will not be broadcast, then the evolution will not be published.
Yeah, right. Well, and to an extent, how do you,
and peer reviewed. The evolution will not be peer reviewed. There you go.
It's interesting, right? Because this is a strange experience that could happen spontaneously. Sometimes it can happen, in an LSD experience. Sometimes it can just happen. But in general, it's not an accessible thing, as though you could buy it. Terence McKenna used to talk about, you can sweep up in the ashram for 10 years, hoping they'll tell you something worthwhile, or you could take 5 dry grams of mushrooms and have the experience of your life. One is definitely obtainable. The other one may be obtainable, but there's a huge desert to cross. There's hours and hours of, at this point, like I'm at hundreds of hours of practice, with this, of sitting on a mat, by myself. Some of it quite unpleasant, especially the pranayama portions for an hour at a crack. Sometimes it felt like being choked in a dark room, because my eyes are closed, especially in the summer, it was hot and I'm constricting my breath. That was one way in which Crowley had that initial experience. Matter of fact, his vision, it's well documented in one of his magical retirements in Paris. He was in Paris as well during that. And at the end of this, and all he was really, most of what he was doing is pranayama. And it's one of the reasons why it's used heavily, in the AA. I think he definitely found a way to wake it up. And this is the thing, it's not necessarily, if you look at yoga texts, there are a lot of different practices. And some of them will say, well, this could do this or this could do that. There's even that one where you're kind of bouncing your end off the ground a bit to try to activate Kundalini, possibly to make the wee loo gland, at the end of the tailbone, which is supposed to be associated with this, to stimulate that to go. But the reality is there's no exact way. We have the 8 stages of Raja Yoga, but no one's saying this will guarantee you. There's a lot of different forms of pranayama. Which one do you use when? Is there a proper sequence? And there really doesn't seem to be. This is a thing that's hard to commodify. We're in a culture where, like you say, someone who wants to sell you Shaktipat for $99, think that we're an instant gratification society, in the thought that this is not obtainable by you unless you work hard at it, or unless you just happen to be incredibly fortunate. And is it fortune? Some people have a terrible time with it. Gopi Krishna, after 17 years of Sahasrara meditation, finally awakens, to a very painful and unpleasant situation that, oddly enough, in a country like India, he could find no help and no illumination as to what was going on with him. In the United States,
that's a point that I stress all the time. That in India, a country known for its spiritual achievement, he found nobody. He said talking with a rickshaw driver was as much of a valid source as some kind of exalted guru.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And you get the feeling that a lot of those, I've seen this. There's a reason why, I'm not a part of any particular, by the way, group or affiliation. There are many lineages of things like the AA. I have enough books back here and things that I've studied heavily and that I apply. I figure, again, looking at things, applying it, and seeing what's right for me, somewhat an intuitive manner, seems to work. And I do get places and feel good in my progress. But yeah, I'm kind of losing my train of thought with that. Ultimately, there's no one that you can buy this from, or I kind of lost that train, but oh yeah, I know where I was going with it. I'm one person, but I've read in many things in Kriya Yoga. There's a great book by Stevens on Kriya Yoga, and in there he talks about the same thing. There are groups that'll get together. They'll pay like some groups in Europe who will pay a Kriya Yoga, yogi to come to Europe, and they'll pay his way and put him up, and they'll pay for these Kriya Yoga initiations, and all they get is mostly abused. They're not to question anything. There's no real information given. And you can tell that this essentially is just this person's way of getting, free passage out of India for a while to go teach people.
Look, I love the one. I was actually familiar with a yogi who would confer Shaktipat via his penis.
There you go. And that's a possibility, right?
That's a good deal. Get put up and get lots of vaginas to transfer your Shaktipat through. So yeah, it is ripe for bad juju. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And there's a lot, even people who are more honest about it, who do teach in it. I mentioned Stuart Ave Olson. Again, he's a translator of Taoist texts, but he himself was straight out in one of his books to say, the book Refining the Elixir. And essentially he said that he himself had not had the full experience himself. He's worked on it for a long period of time. But this is a person who spent a lot of time learning about Chinese culture, Taoism in particular, and the Chinese language, today, be able to do translation. That doesn't guarantee that a person is going to actually have this experience. And I think to an extent too, once in a while, you'll get people who just become so jaded, they don't really believe the experience exists. So like anything, they look for a way of making money off of it. But there's a lot of people who are getting past the idea that gurus, are somehow or another going to do it for you. I think it's a potential that either you work toward and maybe you'll find your way with it, and we live in the wonderful thing is we live in an information glut. Our problem isn't not having enough information. Our problem is telling what information is valid and which is not, and I like
that was probably my salvation, having just two books to work with when I started this work, the Secret of the Golden Flower, and then ultimately Kundalini, the Evolutionary Energy in Man. I mean, I went into a huge bookstore in New York and to find something out, and somehow I was just drawn to that. I found myself in front of this shelf, and I looked, Kundalini, the Evolutionary, and I said, I wonder what that is. And boom, I started, within 3 pages, I saw that's what happened to me. Why, God. And now it's an overflow. It's like, and you know, you get into things that aren't really good for you. Or you start, one of the problems I see with people is they start one thing and then they overlap it with another. They add another, and they're doing 7 different practices and getting nowhere, and they're frustrated. And but they're so excited and excitable that you can't calm them down and say, you know, pick one thing at a time. I don't care if it's mine, but just get something you're comfortable with it and stick to it.
Dedicate yourself to it, right? You know, and assume there's going to be long, dry periods where not a lot seems to be happening. You know, and I guess what I really enjoyed about your books too is that you don't complicate it with technical language. Like Arthur Avalon's book on Kundalini has been out for a very long time. You know, but it's filled with Sanskrit terms. It's an academic work on Kundalini, but it's very difficult to understand, and it's really not going to get you into a practice necessarily, you know. So,
well, even The Secret of the Golden Flower has a lot of dogma, and that's one of the things that Cleary does point out, is that there's a lot of dogma and doctrine, Buddhist dogma and doctrine you can skip over, that the practice is just couched in there, sometimes even hidden in the text. And that's what I try to do in that analysis of the Secret of the Golden Flower, Kundalini meditation method, is to just bring out the real method, the steps.
Right. Very practical and very straightforward.
Like a field manual, absolutely useful. I mean, and I think that that's kind of really, as far as I can ascertain, is the fact that JJ's been there, walked the walk, figured this out, and is sharing it with other people that are on the journey. That it's kind of like JJ's taking our hands and leading us. And that's very, very useful, because it is very poetic and metaphoric. And, you know, I was looking at the actual translation of the actual document, and it's talking about a square inch of the face inside the face. I'm like, whoa, like how you even sorted that out, JJ, is very commendable.
I know that language, yeah. Well, I just kept sitting and I just kept breathing, and I noticed that the more I sat, the more silent my breathing became, the longer the breathing cycles lasted. And all of a sudden, it was breathing me. And from then on, I wasn't doing much of the work. It was doing me. But I had to kind of say, okay, I'm going to try this breathing exercise. I'm going to try breathing through the nose only, and, and the counting and all those other steps we've talked about.
So you can't turn this off, JJ. You can't say enough.
No, it's doing me, and it has been doing me.
Yeah, see, that sounds really scary to me.
Well, that's what I'm saying about benign, is that if I'd known then what I know now, it would have been a hard decision, because, sure, I can't complain, but it changed things dramatically, and probably all in all for the best. I mean, I can't, I really did suffer from a syndrome of thinking, something's going on somewhere and I'm missing it, that type of thing. And just this lack of self-assurance and feeling that I was going to end up uselessly, because I felt I had something to do in life, but I had no idea what it was, and it just seemed like I wasn't getting there. And then all of a sudden, this thing came along after a year of breathing practices, and all of a sudden, wow, there's more to life than meets the eye. It's just, how could that be?
Oh,
it's not possible. I mean,
and I think it depends where you come. Like I've always seen the end in everything. I guess to me, life has always been somewhat ephemeral. It's you know, when you see something like a child, eventually a child's going to grow and mature and die. I mean, I kind of see the end point in everything, and I always have. I've always been drawn to this to know that there's something more. I guess the cycles that we go through in life, we grow up, we educate, and then we work a job, and then we die. And it always seemed like there had to be something more to it. And that's why it's driven me, and pretty much so my entire life. I've always been attracted to the occult, to the inexplicable, to say that there's a crack in here somewhere. There's a crack in either our cultural idea of what life should be and how it should be lived, to the point where, and when you look from culture to culture and time period to time period, they're all different, So I thought modalities of existence are relative, so I've always looked for that crack in the cosmic egg, to kind of peer through.
The great
it gave me a new perspective on death, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Like death didn't matter. There was no end. It's just different stages and of existence, and like what they talk about in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the bardos, and it's easy to accept that there's.
Well, I think we're going to have a talk on death, because that's a very interesting subject indeed. But I want to thank both of you. This has been a wonderful discussion. I feel like I've taken more time than I had asked in the first place. So thank you so much, JJ, for coming on and sharing your wisdom with our audience. And John, your scholarly knowledge is mind-blowing. So thank you so much for coming on and chatting. And I feel very, very blessed to have you both here, and to have our audience be exposed to this amazing information, JJ. So hopefully this helps a little bit in getting the word out there.
Who is the audience, by the way?
Magical Egypt fans on YouTube.
Oh, is this going to be in the show, or is it outside the show?
This is outside the show.
Oh, sweetie. Okay. All right.
Yeah. Sorry, John, you were going to say something, darling?
Just want to say it was wonderful to meet you, JJ, and I really enjoyed your work, so far. I've really enjoyed it quite a bit, and I thank you for what you did. Most certainly, what you've done is you've made a process that is somewhat esoteric and almost beyond grasp, far more graspable. So I appreciate what you've done in all of your work. And thank you very much.
Think about writing an Amazon review, John.
Okay.
I bet you John could write a great one. That's for sure. I should have a chance to do that too, JJ. We'll get onto that for you, my loves. Well, thank you.
Good.
Thank you very much. And gentlemen, have a wonderful.
Well, I love your approach and your spirit, Venise.
Oh, thank you, John.
No, you're so exuberant. I just love it. It's like, look forward to it.
Oh, sweetie. Well, thank you. That means so much to me. I'm glad. I'm very, very glad. As I said, I'm the complete neophyte out of you guys. And so,
well, the thing is that you somehow you've got it all. It's certainly enough to ask the right questions.
It's because I read you, sweetie. That's
why. No, yeah, but it's way beyond me. You know all about magical Egypt and a lot of the stuff that John talks about. By the way, John, could you recommend a good Crowley book for me, knowing my limitations? And
one that's really good, I talked with Venise the other day about it, was Magic Without Tears, where it's Crowley just writing letters. It's a compilation of his letters to people who were in the AA, and he would just talk about certain topics and give his ideas about them. It's a really good one, because other than stuff like Magic in Theory and Practice, which really gets into the detail of his thought on magic, that one is more conversational, and I find he's really good in that. So I would.
What's the name of it again? I'm just going to write it down.
Tears. Yeah.
I'll make you two friends on Facebook as well, so that you can pop links across.
Sure.
Are you already friends with JJ, John?
No, I didn't. No, I don't know why. I would have, oftentimes I follow authors on there, so I probably should. Yeah.
Yeah, but I use these sites. I've got a site, a group called Science and Spirituality. And I've got a page called, Life Force Books, and then another one, the Kundalini Consortium. And that's the one that those two, the Kundalini Consortium and Science and Spirituality. Those are the two where other people offer. By the way, have you looked at the Kundalini Consortium blog?
I
John?
have, and I've seen some of the videos too, the YouTube videos. From the
okay.
Consortium, yeah, and I've explored your page quite a bit too. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
As I said, that's how we found you, JJ, because John has done the legwork for us, which was really great. And I'm so glad that he did refer you, darling. So it's all very lovely. And I'm just so happy, honestly, that we got to connect all together, because it's so lovely to have, you guys speaking against each other, or, to each other about this topic. So I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was a very, very, very good conversation.